matter.
Okay, we are back, the Jesus Way podcast. Very excited for today's conversation and so glad so many of you are tuning in each week. And we want to remind you that the purpose of this conversation, and that's really what this is, it's a conversation about what's going on in the world and a chance to be able to say, what is the Jesus way here? Because so many of us are influenced by what big tech is saying is important. So many of us are influenced by what political commentators are saying is important. So many of us are influenced by what the latest podcasters, the Joe Rogan experience, the Jordan Peterson experience, that type of stuff. And it's like there could be some truth in those things, but we're looking at it through but what is the Jesus way? What is the Jesus way? Because we're shaped by God. We're shaped by his word, and his truth lives in us as followers of Jesus. And so very excited about today's conversation. Today, we're talking about difficult people. Matt, does that strike a chord for you? Just when you hear the word difficult people, what happens in your body? What happens in your mind?
A lot of things. If I'm honest, one of them goes like, I wonder what people think I'm a difficult person. Right.
Yeah.
But initially, I have people in my life that come to mind or have come to mind, and I have different seasons where it feels like um, certain people are more difficult than others. And so my mind just goes to I'm a person that just doesn't want to spend my time on not lost cause is the wrong word, but on in situations that give me grief, right? Like if there's a particular situation or a particular thing that I don't enjoy, right? I idolize comfort and pleasure. So if I don't enjoy it or if it gives me grief, I to my as best of my ability, I want to avoid, eliminate, move through, move past those types of things. And so when I think of difficult people, my initial reaction is like, I just want to have as little to do with them
Yeah.
as possible. And yet, I don't know if that's what God calls me to, right?
Right.
I think there's some wisdom in that, but I sit here and I go, all right, God, well, what does your word say in this? And then immediately I'm convicted about different things. Because I'm one of those people, I don't know if you do this, but if I have a difficult situation or a difficult person in my life, I have really awesome arguments with myself while I'm driving,
Mm.
typically, or while I'm taking a shower, and I'm owning these conversations. It's amazing how intelligent I am in these particular types of conversation. And at the end of that conversation, it's like, oh Matt, you're so right. Like, I'm so sorry. I need
Yeah.
to be better, and I'm going to change. I'm going to be different, right? Like that's obviously never the actual outcome, but um, that's what I do. And so it's easy to know if I'm in a situation where I'm having more difficulty with particular people in my life because I'm having those conversations more when I'm driving or when I'm taking a shower. And I don't try to have them. They just start firing off arguments and stuff in my head. I remember one time I was driving and Megan was in front of me. We were in two different cars. And she asked me, she's like, who are you talking to? Because I was like, all into it. My hands were
Right.
going. I was literally like saying the words out loud, and I was like,
Yeah.
I was
You were
having
having a
this.
conversation with a difficult person without them there.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the kind of people who are difficult for me are people who have certain characteristics, certain qualities that just rub me wrong. Prideful people really rub me wrong. I find prideful people very hard to listen to and be around. People who are not teachable, people who, and I guess that's a form of pride, I suppose, but maybe on the other side of pride is humility, and people who are therefore not teachable. You can't really say anything to. They're not interested. They don't ever ask questions. They never say things like, "What do you think?" They're not really interested in a two-way relationship. I find those types of people really difficult. I find certain personality types more difficult than others. People who are kind of challenger personality types, I find difficult. Who are just always up for a fight, and like always playing a contrarian. It's like, for those of you who are listening, Matt is trying to get out of the Zoom frames because he sees some of himself in that. You have never rubbed me wrong. I just want to be clear about that. That is actually true. But people who, the contrarians, the always playing devil's advocate, I find really challenging. People who are joyless, people who just walk around with they're like an Eeyore, like everything is like so sad, everything is so wrong, everything. I'm not talking about people who are going through suffering and seeking the Lord or in a season of lament. That is totally different. I'm talking about people who are just soulless and stuck in kind of this Eeyore mentality about the world. And I just find people like that very difficult. How about you? Are there certain personality types that just absolutely crush you?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a personality type, but there's one thing in particular that I have the most difficulty with across the board, and it can be with anyone. I struggle with people who do things or say things that if you did or said to them would be bothered, and cannot see that, like have an inability to recognize that they're not different, right? The ones that are like, the pot that calls the kettle black type person. Those anybody and anyone that does things like that, I deeply, deeply, deeply struggle with, because in my mind, I'm just like, that's absurd.
Right. Yeah.
Because you of all people should then be able to recognize or see why somebody else is bothered. But when you do it, it's different. But when it's done to you, it's the end of the world, right? And so that is probably the single most consistent thing for me that just becomes incredibly frustrating for me to deal with. Like the other stuff that you said, like there are moments like that for me where I'm like, oh yeah, but for the most part, I can go, whatever. Like for a person that is unteachable, I'm just like, all right, cool. Well, I just won't teach you, or try to, right? I had it was actually a biblical teacher was talking about that once. He's like, before you ever get in any type of like conversation where you're differing in views, you should ask the person, hey, is there anything I can say or show you that would make you start to maybe think a little differently? If they say yes, by all means continue. If they say no, be like, all right, cool. Well, then there's literally no point in us having this conversation. Because I'm willing to listen to you and maybe have my mind change, but you're not. So this is just there's no sense in that, right? And I can deal with stuff like that. And then dishonesty, I guess, would be the other one. People that are frequently dishonest about stuff. It's hard for me with. I think those are probably the two biggest things that outside of that, I think there are all types of personality types where I'm fine with, and then somebody of the same personality type, if they exhibit any of those types of things, I'm like, oh, I can't do this.
On the struggle bus.
Yeah.
So, again, we're talking about difficult people. And I think so many folks have people in their lives, could be family members, could be children, and it could be that nuclear family, the mother-in-law, the father-in-law, and then people at work who they come across in our daily lives who are difficult. And I think what you said at the beginning is so true of a lot of people. We tend to kind of avoid people like that. We tend to kind of insulate ourselves from people who make us uncomfortable. And I just want to ask the very basic question: what's the Jesus way here?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think in short, it's to not do that, right? Like, Jesus, specifically Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, right, says, you've heard that it is said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say love your enemy. And pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father who's in heaven, for he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, the rain on the righteous and unrighteous. And if you only love those who love you, what is your reward? Every person does that, right? If you only greet those, what are you doing differently than anybody else? Everyone does that, right? And so he calls us to love those that are difficult. In particular, right, like neighborhood church,
Yeah.
Jesus people place.
Yeah.
We are very, very into literally and metaphorically loving our neighbor, right?
That's right.
Because the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, strength, soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. But if we're not careful, we can go, well, my neighbor is that person or that person or that person. Yet Jesus is very specific
Yeah.
when they say, well, who is my neighbor? And he tells them this beautiful story of the Good Samaritan. And the point of that story is that the Samaritan and the Jew, they were not friends. They were
Right.
enemies. They were
Wow.
enemies. And yet the Samaritan, the only one who took his time to help this person. And Jesus then asked, so who was the neighbor in the story? And they said the one that didn't. So basically, I think if we expanded the greatest commandment, right, it's love the Lord your God, love your neighbor, love your enemy, right?
Yeah.
That's the greatest expression of love, as I heard a pastor say. And so when I think about it like that, what does it look like for me to love difficult people? Well, not on that list is avoidance,
Yeah.
right?
True.
To love
True.
difficult people does not mean on that list of how to do so, avoidance wouldn't be found in that.
I think it takes a measure of self-awareness to to see yourself as someone who is avoiding. So often we are blind to our own actions, and when we have a difficult person in our life, we subtly our heart changes. Maybe we get kind of bitter or resentful, or we kind of stop spending time with that person. We avoid that person, and sometimes that becomes normal. It just becomes kind of every day. And so I think it. I think to even see yourself as somebody who is called to love their neighbor, despite the normal and what feels normal avoidance of a person. We have to almost check ourselves. Like I think of Colossians 3, 12 through 14. It's interesting. It says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive. And so there's this, we almost have to kind of self check and kind of go, like, if I'm avoiding, if I'm denying somebody that's difficult in my life the opportunity for forgiveness, then there's something in my heart that needs to change. There's something in me that has to change. And that takes a measure of self-awareness, doesn't it? The ability to look at yourself and go, what is wrong in me that I am withholding forgiveness and therefore keeping myself in prison to this difficult person?
Yeah, and Bible is very, very clear on what Jesus thinks about our, as a believer, our need to forgive, right?
Right.
And we talked about this back when there's a difference between struggling to forgive someone, because I'm a human being and there are people that become very difficult to forgive.
Yeah.
And there's a difference between struggling and refusing, right?
Oh, that's good.
God
Yeah.
is with me and accepting of my struggle to forgive. He is
Yeah.
convicting me and pushing on buttons if I'm refusing to forgive, right? The Bible doesn't leave room for a refusal to forgive. It actually then would ask you, do you understand what I have done for you, right? Like, if
Wow.
I have done this for you, who are you to then able to withhold? Think about the wicked servant who is forgiven a great debt and then wants to demand a tiny debt, right? And it wasn't tiny, like it was a significant debt for a human being, but relative to the debt that he was forgiven, it wasn't, couldn't even compare, right? Um, and it's like, even on the Sermon on the Mount, because if you don't forgive, then your Lord God won't forgive you. And so there is that charge to do so. And then when you think about it, right, like Jesus didn't come to redeem us while we were friends with him.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Like
Right.
he came to redeem us while we were yet enemies of God,
Right.
right?
Yes.
While we were still enemies, he came. And so when I think about it in that regard, it's very convicting if I'm an avoider or if I am a person that is withholding. Because as you said, right, like if I'm struggling with a difficult person and I want to avoid, that means by
Right.
definition, though I don't like to say this, that means that I have some unforgiveness and resentment in my heart, right?
Right.
Because if I didn't, there wouldn't be a struggle. And part of unforgiveness, at least for me, I don't know how you feel, is when I feel like things are unresolved. right? And I
Absolutely.
feel like I have done my part, or I've done as much as I can, or we're in a situation where I can't do anything, right? I'm thinking about like, um, right, if your difficult person in your life is your boss,
Yeah.
uh, it's kind of hard to say things,
Sure, sure
right?
is.
Like you're in a
Sure
position where you
is.
feel like you just have to eat it, and no one likes to feel like they got to eat it, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a situation with family members, right? Like you might feel like you can't say anything because if is what I say going to be received well? Is it
Yeah.
going to make it worse? Is it my place to say something, right? Like when
Yeah.
you think about all of that, and so for me, when I'm in a position where it's like I feel like um, my two options are to offend or avoid, i'm I struggle, and I don't think that's ever the actual two options. But when I'm in a situation like that, it's like, oh, and then it just builds in you, right? Like that's when I start to have those conversations that I talked about. That's when I'm like, oh, this plate, and so, but I have to sit there and go, if this never is resolved, can I love them well? And what does loving them well look like? Right. And
Yeah, one of the things that I wonder about loving people, difficult people, where it begins, because I think what you're saying is so accurate. We have this kind of picture of offending or avoiding, and those seem like our only options when we have a difficult person in our life, whether they're a boss or a coworker or a family member or a child. And it's like, how do I manage this? Well, I think actually scripture speaks to something that we can do to begin the process of loving difficult people. And it happens before avoidance and your
offending,
other word,
offending.
offending. And I would almost say move towards them first in prayer for them. Move towards them by praying for them behind the scenes. So, and this may take a year. This may take years, but every day you begin to pray for them. I would encourage like spouses. If you're having you have a difficult spouse, every day, maybe multiple times a day, you're praying for your spouse. But it's a way that we actually move towards people behind the scenes while we're in the midst of a difficult situation. Philippians 1 9 through 10, 9 through 11. It's my prayer that your love may abound more and more with knowledge and discernment, so that you may approve what's excellent and be pure and blameless in the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ. Why is that important? Because it's his prayer. It's his prayer. All of that other stuff, love, knowledge, discernment, excellence, pure, blameless, fruit of righteousness through Jesus, comes through prayer. And so I would just say move towards people, move towards the difficult person in your life by praying for them every day. Every day. Because we know as followers of Jesus that, prayer changes things, but prayer really changes us. It changes our own hearts. And maybe this is why God calls us to pray. He doesn't need our prayers. He can do anything he wants, but he knows what it does to a human heart.
Yeah. And I would say in that too, right? Like you alluded to it earlier, but also in that prayer and prayer for others, asking God to reveal your own stuff, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because
That's
I
good.
have my part in this. Whether
Yeah.
I feel it's a lot or a little, I have my part. And so making sure that I am addressing that, right? Like,
Mm,
you know, Sermon on the Mount is I think Sermon on the Mount has a great
yeah.
like outline for all of this stuff. But right, it talks about when you're looking at other people's stuff, like when you're
Yeah.
wanting to remove the speck in somebody else's eye, make sure that your log has been addressed. Not because you don't get to talk to people if you're not perfect, otherwise none of us could ever call anybody up, but
Right.
rather so that in that you can say, hey, this is where I'm at, and this is how I'm moving, and this is what I need to own, and this is my part, and I recognize that it's this, but then there's this in you. Right now, I come from a place of partnership in it as
Yeah.
opposed to authority or condemnation, because no one wants to feel condemned, right? We want to feel loved, and so just making sure that, dude, I've addressed me in this, and so it goes to God, Psalm 139. search my heart,
Right.
reveal anything that's hurtful in
Know
me and
my
lead me in the
anxious
way
thoughts.
everlasting,
Yeah.
right? And like
Yeah. That's good.
address that in me, Lord, as I am able to speak to others. Ephesians chapter 4 and 5:1. It's like in all of this, let all of like the anger and slander, wrath, all clamor, all of that be put away from you, and all malice.
Wow.
Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, or forgiving one another as the Lord has forgiven you. Therefore, be imitators of Christ as beloved children. Um, Man, and that's so hard,
Yeah.
right? Like, because I'm a human being and people frustrate me.
Yeah.
And so, what I want to do is this,
Yeah. Shake your hands of it. You know,
right? And add nothing to the fire for the
yeah.
most part. See, I used to. This is growth in me because I think I used to in my life I used to want to add to the fire, right? Like I wanted to like all right, well if we're gonna do this, then we're just gonna do this. And so
Yeah.
let me go buy get the lighter fluid. Let me go get all the kindling. Let's go. Let's just do
Blow
this
this
thing,
thing up.
right?
Yeah.
But I think the problem with that mentality was it only felt good for me for a moment. It's like I got to then word vomit all of this stuff. And so it's like, oh, I got it off my chest. I feel better. This was awesome for me. I'm so glad I said that. I'm so glad I'm relieved. I'm, right?
Yeah.
And then it blows up as it would, and that's no longer there. But then the flip side is like, all right, well, I'm not gonna add fuel to the fire. I'm not gonna throw anything on it. I'm just gonna
Mm.
hold it in. Well, now I'm adding the fuel to the fire inside of me, right? So like there's still a fire and it's still burning and it's still going to explode, right? And it's like
Yeah.
now I'm not saying anything because I don't want to offend you, but neither one of those things are what God has called us to. It's to walk with each other in grace and love. And as a believer, I'm
Yeah.
called to lead in that, right?
You know,
Like
it's
called to
that
lead in that.
Jesus phrase, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you.
Mm-hmm.
So we move towards people in prayer first, and that happens behind the scenes. And we're praying for them daily, maybe multiple times a day. Praying for ourselves, as you're saying, also praying for here that God would do something in me and reveal things in me that are broken. But then there's this kind of active part of loving difficult people, which is the love your enemy part. And you know, just like the old song from DC Talk, you know, way back in the day, throwback, it's love is a verb, right? So love is something that you do. And so I might want to ask the question, how can I actually show blessing and encouragement to the difficult person in my life? You know, like actively. That may be something you say or something you do. And that is difficult, isn't it? I mean, loving your enemies, which is the call of Jesus, is active. It's something that we do on their behalf. I mean, at Neighborhood Church, we talk about loving people, which means serving people's practical needs. And so it's like, what can I do to bless and encourage this difficult person in my life, whether it's a spouse or a coworker or someone in your extended family? This is when the prayers that you've been praying behind the scenes get real. Because it's one thing to speak to God privately. God, show me my brokenness. Is there anything broken in me? God, help this person change X, Y, and Z. You know, it's you're doing that day after day after day. Then it's another thing when Jesus says, "Oh yeah, don't just pray for those who persecute you. Go love your enemies." It's like, oh my goodness, how do we have the strength to do that? Yeah. So you're praying and loving, praying and loving. Yeah.
Well, and I mean Romans, right? Like, right, it talks about like, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink.
Right.
Right? To do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. And it's right, this idea that like, as you're saying, so I've prayed for them, actively praying for them, but now I need to move towards them in action as well, right? And so what does that look like? Well, I think that, like you said, there's a variety of things. It can be
Yeah.
as simple as bringing that coworker a coffee,
Yeah.
right?
That's a good one. Absolutely.
Hey, I'm grabbing coffee tomorrow. Can I grab you something?
Yeah.
Right? Things like that. It's, hey, just so you know, I care about you. I've been praying for you. Is there anything specific I can be praying for? Right? Letting them know that you're praying for them. I have a situation in my life that does not involve me, But it involves two people that I care about very much. And one of them talks about like, I know I need to spend more time with this other person, but it's just hard because I'm frustrated on a regular basis. And so it's like the person that this other, I know I'm being very vague, but the person that this other person is frustrated with is frustrated because the person wants to spend time with them.
Yes.
Right. And so the actual answer is spending time with them, like actual scheduled time with them, but they're frustrated by them, so they don't want to. And it's like, aren't you seeing that, like, if you could just get over your frustration or sit in it for a little bit by spending more time, you're going to alleviate this entire situation and it's going to get better over time. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, sometimes it is that, and it is me having to, or whoever going, I'm going to die to self, as scripture tells me to do, and I'm going to move in this intentionally and go from there and trust God to do what only he can do. Right.
I love that. Josiah, my son Josiah, he just this morning he said, "Hey, Dad, so I have this difficult person." He didn't know we were talking about this today, but he's like, "I have this difficult person in my classroom," and he's like, "Not a good guy. Like he's kind of a troublemaker, and I don't really want to be associated with him." But he always like puts his hand out to shake my hand. Like, what should I do? And behind the scenes, this guy is my son's enemy because he's a troublemaker. So on and so forth. He's got all the issues, and he doesn't want to be associated with them. It's like, ugh, don't like this guy. I don't want to shake his hand. And so the question becomes, what do you do? Like, what does it mean to love your enemy? And we encouraged him to, when you see him, give him a fist bump and smile. And it doesn't mean you need to hang out and be BFFs yet until God changes some things in his life, in this guy's life. Because to have an association like that would not be good for Josiah's soul. He may be tempted to do all the craziness that this guy does. But a fist bump is an opportunity to love somebody and show kindness to them, despite the difficulty that they are to you. And that's similar to the adults giving each other a coffee. That's similar to adults going like, "Hey, let me get you a coffee. What do you want? I'll pick something up for you." That would be a similar thing. And I would just say, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Colossians 3:13 talks about bearing with one another. And it's like, maybe that's what we do. One of the ways we bear with one another is we serve people's practical needs in a very simple and small way over time. And maybe over time, that combined with prayer actually helps us move towards people and not away from them. If they never change at all, that's fine. We continue to buy coffees and we continue to give fist bumps. But we are showing love towards difficult people in our life in some way.
Yeah. I think that's part of the issue sometimes, right? Is like, this is, as you're saying, it's a long game, right?
Yes.
It's not I'm doing this so that you'll be fixed.
Right.
They may never come to the point that we want them to, and that has no bearing on how we're called to love them, right? I'm doing this because God has called me to it. What happens in your life or in your heart is up to God, not up to me, but I'm going to be faithful in that. And I think that's some of the frustration people feel is like, but I did this and I did this and I did this and I did this, and they're still the same.
Right.
Like, well,
yeah.
You're telling me that your mindset and your heart were actually not in the place of love. They were in the place of fixing, so that really it would be better for you, not them. Right. And I find myself in that a lot. And so it's this thing like, I think Jesus is such, I mean, obviously he's the perfect example. But when we think about the disciples, we think about where they went, right? They hung out and spent time with difficult people, what society would call difficult people all the time, whether it was religious elite or those that lived their life in a way that was ungodly and unholy to the utmost, right? And they spent time with them and invested in their lives, but that wasn't their foundation. Their foundation was Christ, and their foundation was each other, right? So their closest relationships were with fellow believers people that they went with into these situations, that upheld them, that loved them, so that that gave them the freedom to spend time with difficult people without feeling, I think, the suck, like the energy suck,
Yes.
right? Because that's some of the problem with difficult people is it can feel exhausting, right?
Yeah.
It can feel relentless. It can feel like this isn't good for me. And I think there's a truth to that. But I think in that we're called to continue to go to them in love, simply because that's what God has asked of us,
Yeah.
trusting that He's going to be the one that changes hearts, not us.
Right. I love that. And to not run away from people, but to keep engaging them in prayer and acts of love over the long game. And I love your point there, because I think that's the mentality we need. Fitness is the same way. It's time under pressure. The mark of a fit person is just consistency over doing the right things every day. Diet works this way. It's just, it's doing the right things day after day after day, 10 months, 11 months. And then you look and you're like, oh my gosh, I've lost 30 pounds. It's the long game. And so it's like, what happens when we actually pray for the difficult people in our life and ask God to reveal things in our own heart? What could happen over the long game? And what could happen in the simple acts of love and service towards the difficult people in our life? What could happen in our own life and in theirs as a result of that? Not that they would, magically change, but that maybe I'm the one that's going to change. Maybe my heart towards them, or my thinking about them, or my posture when I'm with them. Maybe that's what's going to change. Who knows? But it's time under pressure over the long game. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember in high school, right? I was like walking with Jesus. It was very
And you
immature
just did
faith.
that for all the people listening. Matt just
Yeah, I
did
did it in air
air
quotes.
quotes.
I mean, to what I understood, which was nothing, I was right, but it was a very immature faith. It was a very superficial faith. It was very God is a vending machine faith. Uh, but there were people in my life that were really mature and strong believers who spoke into my life well and prayed for me and all of that. Well, I ran away from God in college, and I ran fast and far for a really, really, really long time. We're talking, you know, over a decade and a couple of years, right? Probably more, a little more than that. When I came back, when God brought me back to Himself, I saw some of those adults that I hadn't seen in forever. And one of the first things that they told me is, "We have been praying for you every day since we met
Wow.
you." And
Wow.
so I hadn't seen some of them in 10 plus years, but they were faithfully praying for me. Now, the difficulty that I brought into their life at that moment was probably minimal because we had no interaction with each
Sure.
other, but yet they were praying for me faithfully
Wow.
every day in that, right? And I think that's kind of the same charge as you have spoke to, is
Yeah.
that whether it's a day or a decade or more, what we're called to is not dependent upon the response of the other person. It's what God has called us to, and
Yeah.
then we get to entrust the rest to Him. And with that said, right, like God isn't asking us to live reconciled to people who we're not reconciled to.
Sure.
That's not what He's done.
Yeah.
Um, but He has called us on our end to take care of our part,
Oh, wow.
right? Not withholding forgiveness in our own heart, making sure that we have taken care of our side of the street. If we have anything we need to own, making sure that we've owned that. I'm thinking about particular difficult relationships in my life right now. Like, um, if I'm honest, I have some things to own, right? I may feel that on the scale of ownership, they're really small comparatively, right? Where it's
Yeah.
so my natural reaction is like, well, they need to go first because they're more in the wrong than I am.
Mm.
But the operative word is more in, meaning that I'm a part of. And
Wow.
as the believer, or as the person that can express this, I'm charged to go first. Uh, but it's hard. And so that's my prayer right now, is like God soften my heart so that I can own what I need to own, and truly own it, not superficially, but truly do it, and go from there, entrusting it to you.
Matt, for people in our church who are dealing with a difficult relationship, and they're kind of resonating with what we're talking about right now, because they're thinking about that person or persons, and they're kind of going like, oh, I don't know if I can pray for them. I don't know if I can love them. Like, they're caught in kind of that worry cycle. We have this thing called Revive at Neighborhood Church. Could you just talk about what that is and how that might help people who are
Yeah.
dealing with a difficult person in their life?
Yeah, so Revive is a short introduction to walking in um, recovery, sanctification. Really, it's just how do we walk with God daily in the areas of struggle, right? Some of us have a belief that we need to clean ourselves up before we come to God, but in reality, God loves us exactly where we are, and He's telling us like, you can't clean yourself up. I have to do it. And so we walk through that, looking at basic recovery principles that include admitting our own weaknesses, believing that God can change us, trusting that he wants to change us as we submit our lives to him, taking an inventory of our life so that we can see our patterns of sin and where roots might be, confessing those to God and to other people, actually making a plan to turn from those things. We call that repentance, right? So it's not just saying that this is where I've walked away from the Lord, but instead of that, this is how I'm going to turn to God. What it looks like to continue to follow him in that, to forgive others, to make amends with others, to continue in this, to develop deeper intimacy, and then ultimately to live in a reconciled life to God and with others through all areas of our life. It's basically a slow breakdown of the gospel as we look at people in our life. And why that matters to the conversation that we're having is that many of us, a lot of the struggles that we have, whether we like to admit it, have to do with difficult relationships or hurt and harm caused to us by other people, right? And
Right.
so we respond and we react based on those things which have brought in more struggle, more difficulty. And so we walk through that. And so that's why in recovery circles, and when I say that, I want us to know that in life with Jesus, this is just as important, right?
Yeah.
We have to learn what it looks like to forgive, and we have to learn what it looks like to make amends, to own our part, and then how that leads into reconciled relationship. Because in the relationship with people that may be difficult in our life, there are three steps, and there's forgiveness. So that's me forgiving a person for a harm that they have caused me, and what actual forgiveness looks like, right?
Yeah.
I think we have, as believers and as people, we have a misconception of what forgiveness is. It has nothing to do with the other person. It is between me and God. It has absolutely nothing to do with the other person except for the thing that I need to forgive. And so what it looks like for me to actually forgive. And then amends, which again is another one-step process. It has nothing to do with the other person. It has everything to do with me. And what it looks like for me to own my part, right? And there's a reason that forgiveness comes before amends, because if I haven't forgiven someone, it's going to be very difficult for me to own my part, right?
Wow.
Because I'm waiting for them to seek my forgiveness so that right. And that's not what amends is. Amends is, you know what, this is what I have done, and regardless of your response, whether you accept whether you forgive me or not, whether you accept my apology or not, this is what I have done. This is what God has called me to, and I want you to know I'm incredibly sorry, and would you forgive me?
Mm.
Or sometimes you actually, in the amends, you owe someone an actual debt, and you have to take care of that, or whatever it may be. But it's you owning your part. Again, nothing to do with the other person except that they're a party of what this situation is. Those are the first two steps. And then reconciliation is the first time that it involves all parties, right? That's when the other person involved is also choosing to forgive you, also owning what they have done, that you may live in reconciled relationship. But that has everything to do with what God has done in their heart. And as a believer, or as a person walking in this, because a lot of times it's with other believers, right? So the other believer might not be willing to go first, but we're called to, in hopes that in our vulnerability and our decision to live out what God has called us to, God might use that to stir their heart, that they may also do it, that we all together may live in more freedom, right? And so these are things that we walk through because we all have difficult people in our life, and difficult people, whether we like to admit it or not. I don't, because I'm prideful. So I don't like to admit that people have a stronger pull in my life than I like to say they do, right? But they do, and they're a big part of why we do and say and act in ways that we do.
I would just say that's so powerful, and I would just say that for if you're still listening to this conversation, we want you to join this conversation and come to Revive this year, starting in late February. Mm-hmm. 8 weeks. It's not going to crush you, but it will absolutely help you find freedom. And whether that's anywhere, whether you're dealing with a difficult person or that difficult person right now is you, you will be helped by being a part of a community. We're traveling through Scripture together and understanding what God can accomplish as we submit to His process. And I hope that you guys really consider joining this year and signing up. Details will be released in the coming weeks. You can sign up through our website just so we know that you're coming and prepare for you. But I really do think that this will help you in the place of your struggle, and you will find freedom in the place of that struggle. So many others have, and you'll be in a long line of people, myself included, who've really benefited from Matt's leadership in Revive. So I hope that you sign up. And we want to continue talking with you guys about difficult people in your lives. Look, we are here every single day, and we're a text or a phone call away. Call Matt, text him. He will get right back to you. And even if it's just for the purpose of prayer. Hey, Matt, I just have a difficult situation. I don't want to talk about it too much, but I would just love to pray. Would you be willing? And you are, help is near. So cry out for help. That's what you can do. And then let us step up to that plate and really help you and encourage you as you manage the difficult people in your life. And, Matt, thank you for the conversation today. This is a powerful conversation, and we just want to keep extending the invitation to all of you who are listening. If you have ideas about things that you are interested in, you want to hear us talk about extraterrestrials or conspiracy theories, or you want to have us talk about anger management. We could do any of those things. We're happy to talk about, because the Jesus way there's a way through everything. That's the Jesus way. So we'd love to hear what you guys have to say. So Matt, thank you so much for the conversation. Love you, brother.
Love you too.